2.
Washington Journal continues.
California Republican Darrell Issa joining us to talk about the oversight of the Securities Exchange Commission, which is at the heart of the discussion yesterday up on Capitol Hill with Goldman Sachs and the suit that the SEC has filed against that firm. Just in general, what do you think of the job that the SEC has been doing, is doing?
Well, I think this was one of the most unforgivable political moves that the SEC could ever make. If you don't have a solid case, and clearly they have a case which is very debatable, you saw that on Capitol Hill, the Goldman Sachs thinks they have legitimate, substantive defenses and believes they will prevail in court. Having said that, the SEC released in the middle of a day, during the trading day, this suit information. It is the largest suit in history, so by definition it's the most controversial one to release in the middle of the day. They did it on the same day that their IG released one of two scathing reports on the bad job the SEC has done for half a generation. And we're talking about back into the 90s. They have simply ignored the Ponzi schemes and the difficult cases and gone after what one might call the cheap shots, the easy fines. This case also is obviously timed to come in the middle of a debate on financial reform that would dramatically move power toward the government and away from the private sector. So you'd put all that together and say they could have done this 6 months ago, they could have done it 2 weeks from now. They did it during the trading day, exactly when, quite frankly, the administration and the majority in the House and the Senate are trying to move a piece of legislation that's very controversial.
The Inspector General has agreed to a request that you sent him to look into the timing of this suit. But this is a piece written yesterday in the New York Times op-ed section. Meet the real villain of the financial crisis.
Was he talking about Freddie and Fannie?
Bethany McLean. No, pointing the finger actually at Congress. Bethany McLean says this, but the transaction at the heart of the SEC's complaint is a microcosm of the entire credit crisis. That is, there are no good guys here. It's dishonest and ultimately dangerous to pretend that Goldman is the only bad actor. And the worst actor of all is the one leading the charge against Goldman, our government. Talking about the oversight of the SEC, and there are several articles about the lack of oversight when Republicans were in charge as well. That Congress should have been the one to step in.
Well, first of all, they're right. They're absolutely right that Congress has systematically reduced its ability to do oversight. When Speaker Newt Gingrich became Speaker, he cut the Oversight Committee, which I serve on as the lead Republican, and he did so because he thought, well, you know, we'll do it by other committees. Speaker Pelosi literally cut any kind of, we were the only committee received no increase in budget last year, and the reason was she said other committees will do oversight. The fact is, oversight is a special job, and between the IGs, the GAO, and the oversight committees in the House and the Senate, there aren't enough resources to begin to save the hundreds of billions of dollars that would be saved by better oversight, and it's one of our problems. Additionally, under President, we'll go back to Nixon, every president has been an imperial president. Every president, as soon as they get in, having talked about transparency in government, they immediately change their tune, and suddenly everything is confidential to them. It's their work product. As a result, the Fed has refused, even under subpoena, to deliver proper documents. SEC is reluctant to do it. Committee after committee, including ours, ask for information, and you get slow-rolled, even sometimes with subpoenas. This is a separate problem. You know, Jan Schakowsky was on last time talking about the President's Commission she serves on. We have separation of power. It's about time that Congress be an adversary to wasteful spending and growth of the executive branch unless that growth is specifically authorized by the Congress, something that's not going on right now.
What should be the role of the SEC, in your opinion?
The Securities Exchange Commission has an obligation to transparency in the decision-making process of the individual stock purchasers and sellers. That's simple. They have an obligation to look at our boards, transparent in their practices, so the stockholder knows what's going on. The only thing the Securities Exchange Commission, relative to public companies, really has an obligation on is what do the stockholders know. Now, when you have a situation like a trading company, or let's say S&P or Moody's, people who tell you how good an asset is, then they have a separate question, which is, are those agencies operating on behalf of stock trading and, of course, those who are rating the value of stocks and bonds, are they, in fact, doing their job? Because if they do their job poorly, as the rating agencies did with AIG, where they were AAA right up until the point they basically went bankrupt, then there's the worst part of transparency, which is, look, we can't, as individual stockholders and bondholders, we can't begin to know the details of these complex financial instruments, but we rely on rating agencies. So we have problems with the rating agencies, not yet being dealt with in this reform. Certainly
in the Senate bill that deals with financial regulation. Okay.
We also have a problem, and this was mentioned in your sort of opening. Look, President Bush was touting the highest level of home ownership just as this growing, unsustainable, almost Ponzi scheme-like euphoria of buying homes on greater and greater leverage was reaching its crescendo. The fact is, everybody from the president on down should have known better that you could not have higher and higher level of home ownership when it was more and more expensive and thus less and less affordable. Nobody had any questions that if historic interest rates didn't stay low and homes didn't go up in value, that this scheme was unsustainable. So yes, the blame is throughout government. One of the amazing things, though, is government is trying to shirk any kind of blame by finding a villain. And Goldman Sachs is a convenient villain because of their high profits and relatively small amount of employees. But they're the wrong villain. Private enterprise reacts to government stimulus and stimuli. If we provided all those incentives and set the ground rules that way, then in fact, we are responsible even before we get into the question of did other agencies or groups cross the line, and it's clear we're responsible. Freddie and Fannie, if they had not been enablers, and by the way, HUD is still an enabler, you understand you can get 3% loans with an $8,000 rebate, which means you can get a no money down, non-recourse loan today. If people are buying no money down, non-recourse loans today, then even if they could pay them, if they go down, they will default on them again in large numbers. So government is still an enabler of bad behavior, even as we speak today.
One caller during our first opening segment this morning, we were talking about the Goldman hearing yesterday up on Capitol Hill, said he did not like the fact that you saw senators grilling Goldman Sachs executives, even though they take money have campaign contributions from this company. Do you get campaign contributions from Goldman Sachs?
I actually don't know. I don't think I do, but I could check on that. But I will tell you something that is important for C-SPAN listeners to understand. Judge people not on whether they get money and then turn on people. Judge them on whether they get money and never turn on the people they get money from. There's an old expression I'll paraphrase in this town that you have to be able to take their money and then vote against them. That's shortening down an old axiom. But that's really the standard. Now, if we go to public financing and we take completely all interest money, because there's no such thing as a special interest, the person who walks up or mails in $35 online still has an interest. Whether they can amplify it and get a meeting with a member of the Senate is dubious. But the fact is, unless we do away with public and go to all public financing, we are still going to have people taking money and hopefully doing what they think is right, which sometimes very much means they're going to vote differently than the people who give them money would like. But I think what you have here is it is convenient right now to bash one group and, in fact, say, look, we can throw them under the bus right now because we don't want to throw Freddie and Fannie, which, by the way, even though these were government-backed securities, essentially government entities, their leaders then and now are getting huge bonuses, ones that very much rival Goldman Sachs and the other private firms. We have trillions of dollars of risk. The Fed is essentially holding all that balance sheet. So two entities that are basically government are still paying huge bonuses and still, in fact, not solvent. How many hearings have you seen in either house on that?
Will your committee, the Oversight Committee, have hearings on the role of the SEC?
One of the challenges, quite frankly, is I'm the minority. I don't get to schedule hearings, and I don't get to issue subpoenas unless I can convince several Democrats, out of fear usually, to vote my way on a specific subpoena. We were able to do that. and the Friends of Angelo program, but the countrywide sort of scandal. But for the most part, no, we can't. What we can do is work with the public opinion, if you will, to move toward these hearings. And I do have a pretty good chairman who's trying to be reasonably fair. But there's no question there are things that that the party in power does not want to deal with, and one of them is looking at Freddie and Fannie until, quote, long after they do financial reform, which is just wrong. The same as not looking at the rating agencies as a real part of the problem is wrong.
Congressman Issa is the top Republican on the Oversight Committee, here to talk about that committee and other committees' oversight of the Security Exchange Commission. Colorado, Wayne on the Democratic line, you're our first phone call. Go ahead.
Thank you for taking my call. I have a question for the congressman. One of your colleagues, Representative Marcy Kaptur.
Yes, Marcy Kaptur of Toledo, yes.
Yes. She's asked the Department of Justice to investigate this problem as a criminal case. Now, presently, it's only known as a civil case. But a criminal case under the RICO statutes, which was devised specifically, these statutes, the RICO statutes, were specifically devised and set up to prosecute criminal fraud conspiracies. And this is what we've been dealing with. No one wants to recognize it because no one wants to open the can of worms, I'm afraid, because it would extend out to a number of the other money changers in Wall Street.
Okay, Wayne, we'll get to the Congressman's thoughts on
Wayne,
that.
you have a good point on a number of ways, but I'd like to make sure we put it in perspective. The SEC, for good reason, is doing civil, which is this is a, quote, disclosure question much more than it is was it completely known. The if you will, the shorting capability was known. It was publicly known. So there's a very limited scope of whether Goldman did something wrong asserted. Because if you don't disclose and then as a result people may have invested differently, that's typically civil. Having said that, you're absolutely right that U.S. attorneys should be looking at every part of the meltdown and asking who did what that may have been criminal, and can we do good for this not happening again by finding failure to disclose. And I think when we look at the Ponzi schemes of Alan Stanford and Bernie Madoff, I think you have good examples where it was clearly criminal and they need to go after those. And they're time consuming because people don't usually roll over quickly. One thing, though, I would say is that Wayne is also bringing up a point that Marcy Kaptur and I fought together not to do the TARP. We fought not to have $800 billion floating around in walking around money by the last president or this president. And on that, I think we still agree, particularly when you look at the Fed, who, as we said when we said don't do the TARP, had the ability and has picked up a couple of $1 trillion worth of questionable assets and put them onto their balance sheet, which is what they said they were going to do with the TARP and never did. And so even though it's not criminal for politicians, particularly the president, to lie and get $800, $700 billion and then use it differently, it's not criminal. It's certainly wrong. And Marcy and I worked against giving a president that money, and I still believe it was absolutely wrong to give them that kind of money as a blank check.
So you think both President Bush and President Obama lied?
Well, yes, because President Obama voted for a use, and he's now using it any way he wants to. He's using it as walking around money. President Bush deceived through his administration, not he personally, because they said they were going to use it for one thing, never did. We've had hearings on this, and they try to have a timeline that says, well, we were changing our mind just as we were finally getting the money. The fact is, they took the money under false pretenses. They took it saying they were going to buy up and hold for a period of time these toxic assets. The truth was the Fed could take those off the market without new authorization, and to a great extent did. And the TARP has been used sort of like Stimulus 1, and now you have Stimulus 2. So you really have $1.5 trillion floating around in discretionary money by the administration. It's one of the problems we have in Washington right now is we talk about having oversight. constitutionally, we were never supposed to give them money to just spend as they wish. And that has been a problem. We've appropriated 2 baskets of money that are unconscionable and unparalleled in history. FDR, with all of his heavy majority and all that in WPA, never got the kind of discretionary day-to-day spending that the last 2 presidents have had.
On the Republican line, Ben is joining us from Shreveport, Louisiana.
Good morning.
Good morning.
First, can I make a little complaint on C-SPAN?
If you can make it quick, Ben, that'd be great.
Okay, well, all your letters at the bottom of the screen that y'all used to have, you could read, and it was so nice, and it looked so nice.
Sure.
And now I can't even see it.
Yeah, Ben, it's a work in progress. We're transferring. We're transforming to new high definition, and it's a work in progress. So, but I appreciate your input on it. Go ahead.
Okay, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, y'all Republicans stand strong on this. Dodd's trying to sweep that under the table, and Barney Frank. My goodness, that was the cause of it. One more comment, and someone to stay on Econ, Mr. Republican, stay on Econ. My last comment, and I want a Democrat to comment on this. How are we going to pay for 20 million illegal aliens health care? Now, wait now. And when they're able to bring their family members in, and that comes to 100 million, I'm on Social Security disability. I want to know how we're going to pay for 100 million people's health care.
Ben, you're getting us off on the topic here, and we need to stay.
And I'll try to focus very quickly. Just as a side note, Acorn, I got the notification yesterday the government has shut down their funding again based on court decisions. It's really not in our hands at this point. Federal court, various levels are going back and forth on whether the action we took on a bipartisan basis to shut down Acorn is allowed or not. We're going to stay on top of that. Certainly those of us who do amicus briefs, if necessary, will lobby that we think we did the right thing when we said that they do not deserve to continue receiving our government money. But, back to the point, there is a question, and, you had Jan Schakowsky on last time saying don't worry about Social Security, don't worry about this, don't worry about that. Well, no, these crises are the kind of things that if you take care of them today, they won't be. Immigration reform has to be considered in light of its impact to these social welfare programs that are already financially upside down. And so hopefully all of us will begin to hear the American people and go, you know what? Yeah, we're looking at Goldman Sachs, but Goldman Sachs is an entity that creates capital for private investment. If we kill the goose that lays the golden egg, which is the ability to form capital when you start up a company or grow a company, then in Shreveport, we're going to lose a lot of what we have in the way of job opportunities in the private sector. At the same time, social welfare programs are not going to be paid for by government. They're going to be paid for by Americans who involuntarily send it to government and then hope to get it back efficiently. And it is one of our growing problems of why are we not attacking ourselves for having a Social Security system that's not solvent, for having a Medicare system that actually led inflation in its process, to having a Medicaid system that even with huge amounts of state money is upside down. These are the 3 pillars of social welfare right now, in addition to the earned income credit, and we have no answer. And this caller is in that unique situation where he watches us going after Goldman, and if Goldman's done wrong, we should. But he's realizing we're not dealing with his situation, which is he must live, if he's disabled, as he said, under our social welfare program. He has no choice anymore, and if we don't make sure that net is available for those who must use it, we're going to have a real problem. So it is part of the reason that I question the Goldman timing, because I think the Goldman timing is about changing where capital comes from in this country. And if capital comes from the government, it will never be world-class. We've been a world-class producer of money for innovation, the Apples, the eBays, the Googles. That doesn't happen when government makes a decision. It's almost an accident when they do a successful government project.
West Palm Beach, Florida. Jim on the independent line.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. Can you hear me?
We
Yes,
can,
Jim.
Jim.
Okay, well, I wanted to say thank you for being thoughtful and careful about doing this reform, because I think the future of our country is at stake here. And I wanted to focus in on the rating agencies. The Congressman mentioned those just a few minutes ago. You know, if I understand correctly, what happens when a security is downgraded, some people are forced to sell it based on the rules of their mutual fund and so forth.
Absolutely.
And now what's happening, I'm not that sophisticated investor, but looks like countries are getting downgraded, like Greece. The Greek bonds have been downgraded. And when that happens, some people have to sell, so that drives down the price even further. My concern is U.S. debt, and I hope we don't end up at a point where our debt is downgraded and we suffer the same fate that Greece is going through, and I wanted to get the Congressman's thoughts about that.
Well, you're absolutely right about one thing, is that if we lose our AAA rating, we've got two problems. First of all, it's an excuse for others holding our debt to dump some of them. But more importantly, if we go from AAA to anything less, that magic less than 4% cost of money could become 7, 8, 9, 10, 12%. We all remember sort of the 1979-80 where it didn't matter if they wanted to loan you money, you couldn't afford the interest to pay it back. That could be our problem, is you look at the national debt, double the interest rate, and now instead of absorbing a chunk of our economy's earnings, it's absorbing so much that it squeezes out anything. We would have to choose between the military and Social Security payments if we had a 12% rate based on our current trajectory. So it is important that we keep our rating AAA, because it is how we can manage a debt. It's also important that we have these rating agencies be more transparent. You know, they want to tell us that they have their own private secret way of knowing the rating of a bond, and it's very proprietary. Well, the truth is there's really only 2 agencies that represent almost all the rating. So when you have a monopoly or a duopoly, effectively, and someone says, I have a secret, and that secret clearly failed, then government has, like any other antitrust situation, has to come in and say, wait a second here, you're determining a market. We need to make sure that there's transparency, particularly when you've been proven to be so grossly wrong. And I'm not trying to put all the blame on S&P or Moody's or any of the other very much smaller rating agencies, but we do have to say, and this is an SEC type job, look, can you show us this won't happen again? Can you show us with confidence that AAA means AAA and BBB and so on? And I'm from a state, California, where we seesaw. We go from a decent rating all the way down with some regularity. So we're very aware that a small difference is a huge difference in what's the worth of your portfolio.
Manhattan, Matt is on the Democratic line. Morning.
Good morning. Thank you for C-SPAN. I'd like the opportunity to respond quickly after the representative makes his comments. But I live in Manhattan. I know many people who work on Wall Street, retired from Wall Street, and friends have told me that the majority of the people there are among the most unethical persons that you're going to find in business, and that strong regulation is something that must come about. I always seem to see the Republicans as a party of no. They want to leave the taxpayer holding the bag, and they want to leave the taxpayer on the hook. The Democrats seem to want to get the taxpayer off the hook. I'm no expert, but I know that there's talk that banks should be more liquid. I feel that if you don't get the taxpayer off the hook for the risk-taking on Wall Street, you guys are not doing your job. Just a final point, business liability insurance policies and work compensation insurance policies, if they did not allow coverage for incidents and accidents for business, for illegal workers, if there was an exemption in insurance policies, liability policies for business and workers' compensations, insurance policies, did not allow for coverage for illegal workers, then employers would be forced to employ workers that if there was an accident, if there was an injury, that they would have coverage for legal workers.
All right, Matt, we have to leave it there so we can get more voices in. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, his comments on insurance are thoughtful, and I hadn't heard that before in the debate about legal, illegal. And it is one of our challenges, is what do we deny illegals, particularly in the way of the ability to have a job? California's had that debate. We've decided let's stop them from getting employment if they're not here legally. Well, we're not stopping them from getting their children from getting educations, or the hospitals are not close to them. But his point is a good one, which is, what about the employer who knowingly has illegals and then uses insurance or claims something? And it's thoughtful, and I don't have an easy answer for it. What I would say to his basic comment, which is a good one, what do Republicans usually do? Do Republicans want to throw things on the government? I would disagree. I would say that although the fight not to do TARP was bipartisan, that in general, Republicans are arguing, hold it, let corporations, if they screw up, go bankrupt. I don't care. Now, you know, if General Motors is going bankrupt, of course, the Michigan delegation, Republicans and Democrats, run in saying, help us. But overall, Republicans have said, laissez-faire government, or laissez-faire type government, let the private sector use going bust as an incentive to do a better job and not go bust. If they go bust, let the healthy companies buy them up. And so I would argue that although President Bush didn't say that in the crisis, that the majority of Republicans voted against TARP, voted to have bankruptcy be the legitimate alternative to companies who had made terrible mistakes, and the exception, of course, being the individual depositor. FDIC needs to be solvent, because we've made a promise that if you deposit money in a bank, your deposits are guaranteed, but we've never made the promise we won't wipe out the stockholder if the company goes bust. So I would argue that, and he wants to follow up, but I would argue that actually he's got it the reverse on which party.
The taxpayer may not have to step in, but if that company goes bust, those are jobs lost.
No, they're not. That's one of the great misunderstandings of the market. The only way a job is lost if a company goes bust is if the jobs move overseas. If General Motors goes bankrupt, the question is, will the Marysville, Ohio Honda plant get more business? Will the Georgia and Kentucky Toyota plants get more business? Will Ford get more business? Right now, Ford turned a heck of a profit without bankruptcy and without government money. Well, General Motors had to lie to us on television about how they had, quote, paid off their debt ahead of time, when all they really did was transfer money from one government account to another. So I think we have to be very careful. There are times in which an industry, if it goes away, jobs will transfer overseas. That is where government has to look and say, can we afford to be without a defense industry, an auto industry, farm machine building? But when you talk about an individual company like Chrysler, look, Chrysler didn't make good enough cars to make a profit. They relied on Jeeps and trucks for a long time. General Motors the same way. They made mistakes long before the financial crisis. We bailed them out based on some theory that the financial crisis was at fault. They were losing money long before then and making cars that weren't good enough to compete against domestically produced foreign companies.
Redmond, Oregon. Arby is joining us on the Republican line. Morning.
Good morning, Gretchen. Thank you, C-SPAN. First of all, Representative Issa,
Yes.
God bless you. I called your office yesterday, and your staff must have taken, I don't know, somewhere between 7 to 10 minutes with me. And, you know, I just got off Jan's office while she's trying to just buck us up out here. And her office personnel didn't even know she was on C-SPAN, had no clue, and gave me 3 minutes because she knew where I was going. I tell you what, Representative Issa, I never in my life ever thought I would see my country like this. And I blame everybody, including myself, that we've let this treasure tarnish on us because we haven't taken care of her. The American people are waking up, and let me tell you, I plan on rocking this world. I've been calling since 9/11 every week, any representative tapping weight up there. And, you know, RICO is real important because it was made for mafioso organizations like Econ.
All right, let's leave it there and take the consumer part of this. Are consumers to blame for the situation, the financial crisis?
You know, I don't blame the voters. I don't blame the consumer, unless, as this caller said, in light of where we are today, they're not taking strong action. It's time for Americans to say, look, we talk about not leaving our children a debt. We're leaving our children a debt. we're talking about making sure that these entities like Social Security are solvent. They're clearly not solvent. Not in any, there's no economist that can show you numbers that they're solvent. We talk about healthcare reform when in fact we added to cost versus took it away. The debate began, do we want to go with a Canadian-style healthcare? Well, the Canadians have a system that costs 9% of GDP, roughly 9% of their economy, and their economy is similar to us on per capita. Ours cost 18%, and we made it more expensive. The American public has to say, is government, and for that matter, the board of directors of companies you own stock in and so on, are they meeting their requirement, or are we going to use powers to change that? And if stockholders don't have powers to control a Goldman Sachs or anyone else they own stock in, then we need to make sure they have the power to do it. At the same time, government is at fault. The people aren't blamed just because they elected bad leaders who made bad mistakes, but they do need to ask, do we need change direction? Who's going to change direction? I happen to be a Republican, and we're vying for how we think we would change direction, and the Democrats need to make the same argument.
Next phone call comes from Jane on the Democratic line in Rumson, New Jersey. Go ahead, Jane.
Hello?
Morning, Jane. You're on the air with Congressman Issa.
Hello. No, this is Betty. I'm from Gaithersburg.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Betty, we're happy to have you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I really believe that Congress needs to work together to get this job done, and I'm very distressed at how divided they are for political reasons. And if you look at the Senate, you see Senator Bunning, who is very much against any governmental action. Then you realize that the only reason he's stopping it is his political philosophy, instead of saying, okay, for the good of the country, we need some regulation. And I think both in the House and the Senate that often takes place, we need some governmental regulation, not too much. I think that it was important for Republicans to not distract too much with the idea of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They need to get some work done on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but not let that distract from moving forward and passing a financial reform bill.
Betty, I couldn't disagree with you more. The fact is that it's my obligation to try to do what is right for our country. I swear an allegiance to the Constitution, not to my party. If I think something's wrong, I have an obligation to be cordial, to be civil, but I have an obligation to argue like all get out and to use every power I can to stop bad things from happening. If I think something's unconstitutional, I have an obligation to have it not become law. If I believe that what compromise is being defined as get out of the way and either vote with us or shut up, then I have to say that's not compromise. That's not meeting people and saying, what are your concerns? What are your concerns? How do we bring them together? I spent over 20 years building a company in the private sector. I never asked whether my employees were Republicans or Democrats. I worked with competitors and joint ventures to make new products because we weren't big enough to tool them all by ourselves. I understand what it's about to find win-wins, and I look for them every day. I sit on all kinds of committees in the Congress where we do work on bipartisan basis. I've traveled overseas to try to work on the Middle East crisis and so on, always with somebody of the other party. But understand, as a Republican in the minority, to make the best argument to slow down or to stop bad legislation is our obligation. And oddly enough, particularly health care and now financial, to a great extent, they're not willing to reach out and get one Republican. And people like Susan Collins are certainly people who are known to cross over at the drop of a hat if they agree with you or if you find ways to find compromise. They're not trying to find compromise. That's the challenge. I'm going to blame the Democrats for being heavy-handed. You can judge for yourself. But please, after we do cordial and civil debate, don't expect me to vote with the other party just because they're the majority. I have an obligation to the Constitution and to do what is right. And if my voters want me out because, quote, I'm not go along, get along, they can get rid of me. But to be honest, my voters want me to stay in and move the country a different direction, one that is more fiscally conservative.
The congressman is referring to action in the Senate on this financial regulation bill. The Senate voted again last night to open up debate on the legislation. That vote failed 57 to 41, with all the Republicans voting against, and one Democrat, Senator Ben Nelson, also voting against moving forward to begin debate on the legislation.
Well, and I have to interrupt you if I
Sure.
can. Look, that's the way it's phrased here. When Mr. Smith goes to Washington, it's standing up and saying something's wrong, and he's filibustering. Nobody says you're stopping debate. Well, that's what he was doing. The tradition of filibuster in the Senate is that any one senator, unless the majority of senators, 60 senators, think that senator is wrong on the principles they're trying to slow down the legislation to argue, unless they're willing to override that senator has a right to defend that principle. And it has been vexing for House members, because when we were in the majority, we used to call it the elephant's graveyard, not just because senators were older, but because everything went there to die. Having said that, it also is constitutionally sort of that saucer in which the hot decisions made in the House cool. We can make a bologna sandwich into a law in the House of Representatives. As long as the Speaker brings it to the floor and she controls her majority, they pass a rule and that's it. And we have had bill after bill that did not allow debate. The rules, they call them closed rules. That means you can't amend anything. Well, if I simply say in its present form it's bad, and you say in its present form it's perfect, and you don't allow any of my amendments, even ones that Democrats would vote for, then that's not constitutionally what was envisioned. That's what's going on in the House. So the Senate right now is to a great extent saying, you know what, these things that are running through the House on a purely partisan basis, sometimes with big chunks of Democrats not liking them and even not voting for them, but getting them through anyway, they get to the Senate and one senator or 40 senators say, hold it, we are supposed to be a place of compromise, and we have been, and suddenly we're not. And what I would say to you and all your listeners is, you know, the Senate didn't change that much. If you look at the 40 or so senators who were like Orrin Hatch and so on, we're always working with Ted Kennedy and so on. And by the way, that was when we were in the majority. Do you think that an Orrin Hatch who worked with Ted Kennedy when we were in the majority suddenly won't work with the majority because we're in the minority? Minorities are more likely to work with majorities. If they have a tradition of working together on a bipartisan basis, that tradition only goes away if they're not being allowed to do just exactly that, work with the other side.
Cleveland, Ohio. John on the independent line. You're next.
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can.
Hey, John, are you east side or west, since I'm a native
On the west
Cleveland?
side, not too far from your old alma mater from Kent. I was there for an old.
Okay.
I watch you. You do a very good job. I'm a C-SPAN junkie for 30 years. And two questions. One, even there's no problem in indexing or hedging or futures, but I want to know, conflict of interest is so obvious. The rating agencies, even if there's only two of them, Standard and Poor, are taking this country to poor status. It's too obvious. You should do something more than that, what you have been doing. And number two, even the futures have no problem, even if they want to bring in some future, how the movies are going to fare. That's a new thing. They're going to bring another snake oil. I want to know, why do you allow synthetic instruments to be even traded when you don't allow in gambling, when you don't allow the odds being changed when you're playing the game? I want to know.
Congressman.
John, that 30 years has served you very well. He made several good points. First of all, there is a question about how the rating agencies get their money and whether they have an obvious conflict of interest. And there is a problem. How you get your money does affect who you rate how. And that's been one of the questions about S&P and Moody's and so on. But I think the point that John made is a very valid point. Most of your listeners or watchers have no idea, but we just opened up the ability to bet against a specific movie. We've made, if Terminator 12 comes out and you think it's going to be a dud, then you can vote, you can invest against it. Now, as John said, that's only gambling. There's no investment. This is not capital going into a market. It's purely a bet. And Goldman Sachs' hedging instrument that is the subject of the lawsuit, to a great extent, could be argued to be just an extension of endless kinds of bets rather than legitimate hedging to allow somebody for example, to, in stocks, you can buy something at this price and sell it at this price so that you've bracketed how much you're willing to lose. That kind of instrument, the long and the short, has been around for a long time. And even after gambling was eliminated after the crash of the stock market, they kept that capability. But John's absolutely right. There are lots of instruments that have been allowed for decades now that are nothing but gambling. And if we really wanted to reduce the amount of money being spent gambling in the stock market rather than investing in private enterprise, we would get rid of most of those instruments. And his examples are very, very good.
Congressman, thank you very much for your time this morning.